Welcome to the All in Design podcast, the podcast that dives a little deeper into the world of UX. My name is Lindsey, and I'm a content designer at Kindred, coming to you from London. We'll be joined by UX professionals from around the world to talk about their experiences, challenges, and advice when working in the world of UX. On today's episode, we're joined by user researcher Laure Duchamp. This episode is extra special for me as Laure moved to the Swedish office recently. But today she's here in London, so it seemed only right to get her in the studio and talk all things user research. Laure has a master's in cognitive science and started her professional career at a startup where she got to build games and write articles about psychology. It wasn't until she moved to the UK 3 years ago that she got her first job as a user researcher. Realising that she wasn't made for an academic lifestyle, she heard about something called user experience from her friends, and having read more into it, she decided this was her calling. A career where she could combine everything she learned in cognitive science with her interest in ergonomics and human-computer interaction. She joined Kindred in May 2021, and we've been blessed with her presence ever since. So thank you very much for joining me today, Laure.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're hopefully going to offer some insights and tips on how conducting user research and user testing can help designers to build better products. I think a great place to start would be to get a good understanding of how user research and user testing fits into the work that we do here at Kindred. So can you dive into that a little bit for me?
Yeah, sure. We work with the UCD process. That stands for Understand, Create and Develop. Obviously, the user research fits every stage, but the majority of our research takes place at the Understand phase, which is also called the Discovery phase.
You mentioned that user research fits into every stage of our design process here at Kindred. So what does that look like? How do you work with the designers throughout that process?
Yeah. At Discovery, usually researchers would gather requirements from the business and they'd have a workshop with key stakeholders to understand their user problem. It's really good to work collaboratively with UX designers at this stage because we develop the brief together, not only from a research standpoint, but also from a UX standpoint, so that the insights formulated also to be integrated to later stage with the creation phase. Once we have a clear-shaped brief, researchers usually elaborate a plan for all the studies that are going to be done in order to discover. And designers can sometimes shadow researchers during that phase and observe some interviews or conduct some usability tests. And it's really good to have them involved in the collection of insights and be familiar with the user needs. Then when discovery is done, we've gathered all sorts of insights. We organize a big empathy workshop to go through all the findings and turn them into personas, user stories, empathy maps, journey maps, and all these wonderful tools that will help designers create in their creation phase.
So who's part of that discovery workshop? Is that everyone?
Definitely designers and researchers, and sometimes we like to include stakeholders, although sometimes if we make it too open, stakeholders might question or even ideate at that stage, which we need to really be protective of because we don't want any ideation at that stage. This is just purely integrating all the insights for then allowing the designers to do their designing.
Okay, so a select few,
the
chosen ones.
The chosen ones. Yeah, having both together in that workshop really helps put user pain points and their constraints to life and really helps us emphasize with our users. And that way it's easier also to think of the right solution once you've emphasized well with your users. And there's also some testing involved during the create phase. Designers usually test their ideas to understand how their design solutions impacts the users and if it's solving the pain points they were addressing. And all this fine-tuning is done by designers. They have full autonomy to create their tests. Obviously, we're always there to help them if they need any advice or for more complex research. But we also provide a lot of documentation and resources.
I think that gives a good summary of how you work with designers throughout the UCD process. I think we'll just dive a little bit deeper into all of that. So you mentioned quite a lot there, but let's start at the beginning. So in that understand phase, or as some people may say, the discovery phase. So you talked about getting some insights for the workshop. What do those insights look like? What methods and techniques do you use to get them?
Yeah, we use all sorts of techniques. The most popular ones for qualitative user researchers are interviews, card sorts, or even sometimes tree sorts. And we sometimes do usability tests also. And then we have obviously we're not just the UX researchers, we're not alone. We have CX who do the surveys, and then we have data analytics who provide us with any on-site tracking data that's also really useful. And we collaborate together and create like a whole picture of the user problem, so we don't just look at one problem or pain point from one angle, but we have a fuller picture.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things, isn't it? Being clear on what you actually want to know and find out.
Yeah.
Is that where things like hypotheses can be useful, or is that something that you would use further down the line when you're ideating and making changes?
That's a really good question. I think hypotheses they're good at any stage, but they're not essential, because during discovery, sometimes you don't know what you want to know yet. You just want to discover, right? You want to explore. So you don't even have a prediction on how something's going to work, because you just don't know. So yeah, I'd say we less work with hypotheses at this stage, but more during the create phase. Then we'd have kind of a list of, assumptions on this is how it's going to solve.
So a hypothesis just focuses a bit too much at that initial stage?
Probably, yeah.
Okay. And I think what you said about knowing what sort of tests are required for what purpose comes with practice is such a great point, because I think when I look back at when I first started testing designs and testing content, that was something that I really struggled with, and I think I've slightly got better over time. So yeah, if anyone listening who's struggling, it obviously takes time, and be patient with yourself. Moving on to the create phase, where we as designers take all of your juicy insights and start designing based on those real user problems that we've identified in that discovery phase. What would you say are some of the biggest mistakes designers can make at this point?
Well, I wouldn't say biggest mistakes, but definitely challenges that anyone would face at this phase. Especially handing over insights, it's kind of a delicate art, because ultimately it's the person who did the research would be the closest to what users said and did. So getting designers involved at this discovery stage is also really powerful, I think, because they're as close to the user. One other challenge is making the difference between your own assumptions and what you think users would want, because ultimately that's what you would want, and actually hearing what the data has to tell you about your users. And yeah, I would say another challenge is to start ideating during the empathy workshop, even though I know I also have to resist that urge, because I know I can see all the pain points and everything that's wrong, and I'm like, I just know what to do to fix it. But yeah, we've got to resist that urge and make sure that we don't, put more importance on one thing because we empathize with it more. And we go about it methodologically so that we're not too biased.
It's also hard at this point as well, because you've obviously got all this data about what the user wants and needs, but then on top of that, you also have things like business requirements and stakeholder opinions too. So it can be a challenge. How have you dealt with situations like this in the past, when people, like you said, aren't listening to the data and they already have a solution in mind? Like, how do you deal with that as a designer and as a user researcher?
Yeah. Really good question. I'm going to ask you the same question afterwards. But the way I would deal with it is to always value whatever anybody has to say, but label it and then mark it as, well, this is an assumption. Unless you show me evidence that this is true, then I'm going to just mark it as an assumption, and we're going to see what the evidence has to say. So it's not about dismissing anything, but just labeling, right? So that helps, if someone says something but actually it's not backed with any evidence and people can see that clearly, then this idea is very likely to flow away and be forgotten.
I think it also helps in the way that you present the data, right? If you're always like reverting back to it throughout, it's always like front of mind, both for you and for the stakeholder as well. So you can maybe kind of halt that solutionizing and ideating. True. Perhaps, I don't know. Yeah. It is a tough one, and always a challenge that you have to face and kind of work through on a regular basis. But I think, that was some good advice there. So here at Kindred, the designers you mentioned have the resources and autonomy to test their designs, and we've mentioned it in previous podcasts as well, which is a great thing. It wasn't always that way. We often relied on you guys to sort of do all of the testing for us, but now we can do the testing ourselves, obviously with your feedback and guidance, which is always very, very useful to have. What would you say are some of the best research methods to use when validating your designs? And just want to caveat here that the majority of the time here at Kindred, we do unmoderated tests as well.
Yeah, we're very lucky to have a platform to test with and to have access to, this powerful tool, which gives us access to customers very quickly and get almost instant feedback from any topic. I mean, if you have anything to test, just set it up and boom, you'd have user feedback. So yeah, I'd say definitely usability testing is a big thing at Kindred for designers. And you can do many things with usability testing. Obviously, it's unmoderated, but they can also do A/B comparisons. So having two designs that they'd want to get, you have a solution that you want to measure which one is performing better. We also prepared some documentations and training for designers to be fully autonomous in their setup. And we help them with the formulation of their research goals and questions, and of course with the analysis.
Some of those tools as well have really useful templates that you can use, say, if you don't have a user researcher to help you with some of the questions you may have, or help with formulating the plan and putting together a list of questions. So these templates are really useful, and they actually are split out into the discovery, the create, and the development phase as well, which can be really useful if you don't have someone like Laure on your team. Just one thing I wanted to go back to there is you mentioned A/B comparisons. So when it comes to A/B comparisons with something like qualitative research techniques like user testing, how does that work? Because with the program we use, we have maybe a maximum of 10 to 15 people that we're testing on. Can you really get an understanding of which solution or concept is better on such a small sample size?
Yeah, very good question. Question that stakeholders ask a lot. Yeah, so because this is always going to be qualitative research, it's always going to be on a smaller sample than the quantitative one. But it's still valid because it's all depending on the questions that you're asking. So ultimately, if you're asking for qualitative feedback, you'd understand the why, you'd understand the motivations, you'd see with your eyes the behavior. So if someone's, clicking faster on one design than on the other, where you'd see the mouse going all over the place, then you'd be able to deduce, well, this is true, I can see that this design is more effective than the other. So that's the kind of thing. But obviously, it would be, instead of being backed up by statistical power, it would be backed up by empirical, visual evidence of the behavior and what they say.
And would you say you had the two designs and you had 10 people, would you show them both those two designs and get them to sort of talk around those two, or would you show one design to a group of people, one design to another group, and then compare it that way? How does that work?
Yeah, I think that would be the way. It's actually the way it's programmed on the platform. So you just show one design to a part of the group, and then it's randomized. So if a person has seen design A first, then the second person will see design B first. And that way you know that there's no kind of bias in the fact that you've shown this design first and the other one last. And then you'd be able to compare both if you want. So both designs, one next to another, to see really what people, so they'd see both designs to see which one is more appealing to the other.
Okay, good to know. So I guess before you get to that point where you're deciding to do this A/B comparison test, you need to come up with some sort of testing plan. Do you have any top tips for anyone who's just getting started on user testing, or someone who maybe just wants some more advice on how to create a good test plan?
Yeah, I'm still working on that one. My first tip would be to start with your research goals, which are different from the research questions. I know usually we struggle differentiating both, but the goals are addressing what you want to find out in this test. It's just like, by the end of this test, I will know X, Y, Z. So these are your goals. The unknowns that you want to turn into knowns, kind of. So first research goals. And another great test technique would be to list your assumptions. If you have any, you don't have to have any. So for example, if your goal is to, increase the likelihood of users to click on a CTA, then you might have 3 different ideas on how to do that, targeting that same behavior. The first idea would be to increase the font. The other would be to change the color contrast. And the last idea would be to change the position of the button, right? So there must be specific reasons why you chose these 3 solutions. And basically your assumptions would be those reasons. So it may be that you think that people missed the button because it's not salient enough, so that's why you increased the font, or because the color contrast wasn't good enough, so they missed it, or because they weren't on the right position on the page where the CTA was. So that's why you changed the position of the button. I don't know if that's clear, but basically these are all assumptions, and just listing them will help you know what elements in your design are working with the behavior that you seek.
So that to me is starting to sound a bit like hypotheses, right?
Yeah, it's okay. The same, actually. We just, I don't want to talk about hypotheses because it has that. It's a bit of a scary word. It's way too serious and academic, so, but it's the same. It's the same thing.
So that's good. So you start with the goals, and then you move on to the research questions.
Yeah, research questions, some assumptions if you have any, and then
Cool. And then, so with the questions, that's probably one of the things that I always find the hardest, to sort of have the right structure, so you're getting all of the right information that you want to validate your assumptions. So there's obviously more task-based questions you can ask a user to kind of go there or go here to see whether they understand that and they do go where you want them to go. Or you can ask a user to give more of a verbal response about a feature, like more of an opinion, for example. How do you know what to ask and when? Can you give an example of when you would ask a user to show you something versus tell you something, and what are the benefits of doing either of those? There's quite a few questions in there.
How much time do you have? Because it's going to be a while. Yeah, I think the difference ultimately between show and say is if you want them to say something, it's because you want them to explain something they just did or their expectations. So something they can't show you with their behavior that you'd need them to speak out loud, then definitely go verbal. But if I need to, without telling anything, watch them perform a task so that I know how, without giving them any clues if they manage to do the task successfully or not, then definitely I'll go for a task. Because the trick sometimes, if they tell you something, then you don't really know if that's true. For example, if you tell them, do you like this? Then they're more likely to tell you, yeah. So that kind of thing. So you can't really always rely on verbal responses. So that's why I like alternating between both, and also have a lot of behavioral cues.
Okay, thank you. And when it comes to things like multiple choice questions, what's your opinion on using those? Because sometimes I feel like having a question with multiple choice answers is kind of leading the user into saying something that you maybe have already assumed.
Yeah, it's true that, it depends. You can have multiple choice and also not, like false answers. Well, answers that would be kind of absurd if you don't want to be too leading. Or you'd have like an open section comment box where they can say, well, specify other, and I have something else to say. Multiple choice can also be useful sometimes if you want to have kind of a measuring element to your metrics. So once you'll review the whole test, then you'd have like X amount of people replied this answer, and this gives you kind of an overview of the trends. And obviously, since this is qualitative, you always have to take this and cross-reference it with other measurement, but it's very useful when you also want to like analyze quicker.
One question that we always tend to ask here, which is, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? Or is there anything you would change about this product or this feature or this screen? And I think sometimes that's sort of misleading in a way, because you're asking someone to pick things out that maybe they wouldn't have even thought was an issue until you ask them to go and look for that issue. What do you think about that question? Should we stop asking it, or is it useful in some way?
Yeah, I think, originally it was meant to be just an open-ended for if you have any other type of feedback that we haven't covered, or if there's an improvement that I haven't touched upon that you think is very important, then this would be the time to mention it. So this is kind of the goal of this question. But yeah, sometimes it opens up a Pandora box and you wished you hadn't. But I think it's always, even if it's not direct useful feedback because you're not working on that, then it really depends. If you want specific feedback, I'd say always be more specific in your questions, because otherwise, if you're, focused on the content and you really don't care about feedback on the layout, and you ask them, what would you change to make it better, then they'll be like, oh, I don't like that color, I don't like that UI. And you're like, that's not what I'm here for, because we haven't been specific around the questions. Maybe sometimes change it to a more specific question helps.
That's a really good point. So I've found in the past as well that it can be really easy just to get carried away with questions. So like, well, we could just ask this. Oh, what about if we ask that as well? And then you just all of a sudden have like 20 odd questions. Is there a case where there's just too many questions?
Well, not from a research point of view, because we love asking questions, but I would definitely say that participant fatigue is a thing. So you've participated in tests in the past, and obviously if you see that there's 20 questions ahead, you're probably less likely to take it. And so that has an effect on your, I guess we call it incident rate. It's just like the number of people who would participate in your test in a given amount of time. So you'd have to wait longer for your test and to be completed and everything. But also, yeah, by the end, they are very likely to not give you the feedback that you want, or to be just very tired after answering all these questions. So I would say after 10 to 15 questions, participants start being fatigued. So you'll have like less feedback. So what's the point?
And also you have to remember as well, like the more questions you ask, the more tests and answers you have to listen to when you're going through all of the research and the testing that you've done. Speaking of that, so once you've got all of that data and all of the tests have been completed, do you have any advice for tackling that? Because you could end up with 10 participants, 10 to 15 questions. That's a lot of information to take on board. Like, how do you tackle that?
Good question. I think, yeah, definitely speeding up to watching it at 1.5 speed really helps. And then also create a board for analysis. So we've also done a template for designers where I'm going to try to describe it, but it's a visual thing. So you'd have columns depending on what you're measuring in the test. And then for each participant you see doing or saying something, you'd add a card to the corresponding lane with the participant number. And then each time you hear feedback that is similar, instead of writing again, oh, I've heard the same thing, this participant thinks that too, just add the copy paste another card, and that way it just adds up. And this is really useful for seeing trends and also keeping track of, oh, okay, I've had this feedback before, like how many has it been? Well, 5 people have said that. And then you have already like a visual pictures of themes and the number of people who said.
And I can confirm that template is much better than the original way that we were doing it, which was just going through user by user, and then you were just realizing that you were writing the same things, going back up to the top of the page and copying and pasting things back down. And so having used this new template, it is a lot easier and a lot easier to visualize the key things that are coming out of the testing. In the design team that I work in, what also works quite well, it doesn't necessarily save time, but it motivates you to listen to all of these tests, because it can be quite daunting. When I first started out user testing, I would often have to just sit and listen to them all on my own and make notes, and it was hard to motivate yourself to get around to doing that. So what we do is like we all join the call together and we make notes, and that also helps because sometimes as a content designer, I might be working with a product designer and they might pick up on things that maybe I miss as a content designer, and also I might just miss in general because we've listened to so many tests. So it's good to have more than one person on the call listening to the tests as well, just in case anything is missed. So on the topic of when I first started out with user testing, some of the mistakes I made is that I would take the thoughts of one person as gospel and start making changes based on that one opinion, which I now know is not the right thing to do. So what are some best practices when it comes to analysing the tests and knowing what to do with the data you have? So, for example, if you have 2 to 3 people out of 10 participants, they said something didn't make sense or they didn't like that particular feature, is that enough people to say, look, I think we need to address this issue, or is that completely wrong?
That's a very hard question. But yeah, actually with the board that I was talking about, it actually helps getting the overview picture. So you'd see, it would help kind of balance the feedback that you've had and see if it's a trend or if it's not a trend, basically. Also, one important thing is to understand why the user has said what they said. And so if they don't like one feature, it's not that relevant in itself that they don't like it. People are different, they like different things. But what's interesting is why don't they like it? If they don't like it because of a usability issue, then this is interesting too, because you want to address that usability issue. If they don't like it because of colors, then, well, this is your brand colors, so you're not going to change that. So yeah, I think, that's in that sense, that's why it depends. Yeah.
So it's a case of not taking that opinion at face value. It's sort of diving a little bit deeper into why they said it.
Definitely. It's always very healthy to question and try to understand why they have done what they did and they've said what they did, because sometimes it's going to be valuable, but I guess you have to use your common judgment on that as you do have experience.
So during the creation phase, there could be multiple iterations. You've tested it once, you've taken that feedback on board and you've made some changes to your design, or maybe you haven't, it was perfect the first time around. But is there a case of ever doing too much testing? Like, do you just sort of go around in a circle and an endless circle?
Yeah, because the more you know, the more you want to know. If a stakeholder asks you a question on, but have we tried understanding this? And you're like, oh yeah, that's an angle I haven't covered. So you can get stuck into an ever testing loop. But at some point you have deadlines that help you with not asking too many questions. And the best thing to do is, use your design expertise to make the call, right? So at the end of the day, as long as you've tested the major goals that you've agreed on testing over and over won't give you a more accurate result, because ultimately it's all just a testing environment. It's not real life, and there's no way of knowing. A lot of people are going to hate me for saying that, but obviously testing environments can mimic real life, right? And there's a lot of value in that, but we're just mimicking, and we never know what in the world might happen that will, change the course of things. So it's important to just stop at some point, like, I've done it. Enough research. Okay,
cool. And I guess sometimes you're lucky if you can even get one round of testing in. So if you're in a situation where you can do lots of testing, then that's always a good thing. With that in mind, is there anything you can do if you don't have time to test your designs with actual users, or if perhaps you don't have access to a platform that we have? How would you go about doing that?
I think there's always people surrounding you that you could intercept. I know that in the foundation community, you guys develop internal tools or things for designers and developers. So your audience is kind of the people next door, right? Having just any external feedback is valuable. There's also obviously some heuristics principle, right? That you can run a heuristics evaluation on anything just with your UX expertise. And I would say just even doing that is something, but guerrilla testing is also an idea that comes to mind.
But what you're saying is that there are means to do it if you don't have access to user testing.
Yeah.
Okay. So before moving on to the develop stage, one thing that I would love to get your thoughts on is when you're at that stage of presenting your solution to stakeholders and you try and defend your design decisions with user feedback. And sometimes at this point, they usually start to ask you, like, how many people have you tested this on? And our answer is usually like 10 to 15 people, because that's the limit that we have per test. The stakeholders at this point sort of tend to roll their eyes and question, like, why have you made key decisions based on such a small amount of people? Like, how would you respond to this? Because it's happened to me a few times and I always like stumble over my words and try.
It's true, I haven't good enough.
I find it hard to kind of say why.
I know it's always been a bit of a bias that quantitative kind of trumps over qualitative sometimes in certain companies at least. But I would emphasize that the type of feedback is very different. So the things that you would get with qualitative, which is answering the why behind, you'd never get with numbers, right? You'd just see what happens and you don't know why that would be. You can always guess. But I would say that in qualitative, so in our framework, 10 to 15 is actually very significant, because we're measuring if something is not right for 5 people, then you can easily assume that it's going to be a blocker for more people, right? If like 1, 2, 3, 4 people miss something, then you do have to fix it for them at least, because it's like, it's a representative issue.
And I guess sometimes when you do more iterations, you do end up increasing that number quite a lot. Because I remember something that I've worked on in terms of testing our design system internally, we did maybe 3 or 4 iterations, and so therefore that kind of pool of people starts increasing and you get more of an idea of it's never going to be like quantitative, but it's getting bigger and bigger.
And also, you've reviewed 15 interviews for the same issue. At some point, you'd start seeing the same feedback over and over again, and you're like, I'm not learning anything new, right? Even before you have the 15.
Yeah.
So that's a good indicator that actually you've reached your maximum point of I've learned all the things that I could learn,
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've spoken about the discovery phase and the create phase. So when it comes to the develop part of the user-centered design process, how does user research come in there?
Yeah, usually designs, when they go to the develop part, so we hand out to developers, they implement our solutions. There's obviously some QA, so quality assessment involved. So user research usually can't do much at this stage because the understanding why phase is past. Usually you would have understood why, hopefully. But yeah, however, we do prepare our work for success measurement studies. So this is after launch. We do success measurement to kind of measure how successful our works and effort have been. Yeah.
At what point do you start measuring? Is it like a couple of weeks after, or is it like a month?
So yeah, again, it depends. So if you're testing something that would require some adoption and, people getting used to your product to see if they're satisfied about something, a certain feature, something like that, then obviously you'd be waiting for the dedicated amount of time to be able to measure anything. But if it has something that impacts marketing, marketing campaigns, then obviously you'd want to capture it as soon as it happens, as soon as people see it for the first time, because you want to capture first impressions.
Great. So before we wrap up, do you have any last tips or comments for anyone starting out with user research, whether they're a researcher or a designer?
I would say enjoy. Don't be afraid to do lots of pilot tests, either with your colleagues or a few people outside your company. Research always takes refinement, especially with qualitative research, because you're dealing with complex human behavior. And yeah, I would say, like in anything, practice makes perfect.
Yeah, I think that's some really good advice. I mean, I started user testing maybe a couple of years ago now, and I still feel like I've got so much to learn. And yeah, I really enjoy doing it. It's really good to hear from the users. It's really good to back up your ideas and concepts with actual user research. And it's always good to share that with stakeholders and other designers as well, because it might be something that you're doing, but another designer can learn from it as well for things that they're working on. I think we've covered a lot in this episode, really useful help and information and insights into user testing. Hopefully you guys find that useful. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, Laure, for joining me today. It's been so nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
This episode marks the end of the first season of the All in Design podcast. We've had some great guests and covered some really interesting UX topics. Everything from changing careers to learning how content designers and product designers can get the most out of each other. Thank you so much for listening. If you've missed any of our episodes, you can find them all on our Kindred Group YouTube channel or our Spotify channel. Just search All in Design Podcast. Join us for the next season when I'll be joined by more of my fellow UXers. I'll speak to our service design team to find out more about the importance of user journeys. I'll also be speaking to our colleagues in other cities to discuss how best to design and collaborate remotely. Thanks again for listening. We hope you can join us for season 2 of the All in Design podcast. See you there.